Welcome in, everybody. You know how this works. You send us the stuff and we get into it. Today's a bit of a head scratcher, at least at first glance. We're diving deep into starting new churches. And, a lot of the material you sent over raises some really basic questions, like why even bother? We've got churches.
Right off the bat, yeah. It's like, why start fresh when there are already places to go? And the stuff you sent, it brings up those hesitations people have. Like, doesn't this weaken the churches we've already got? Or is it something only the mega churches should even think about? And behind all that, is there even a vision for why this matters?
It's almost like we assume churches just are.
Totally. But one of the sources, it pulls this quote from Donald McGavran way back in 1965, and it kind of nails it. He said the real crisis in missions wasn't lack of trying, but a wrong strategy. And by that, he meant not putting enough focus on actually bringing people to faith and getting them into local church communities. He was all about multiplying those communities, not just maintaining what's there.
So more than just keeping the lights on, right?
Way more. It's about growth and reaching people. And that's what we're going to unpack today, based on all the stuff you've sent. What are the reasons, biblically and practically, for starting new churches? And what are the principles, the guidelines that make it work?
All right, well, let's get biblical for a minute. When we crack open the New Testament, what's it saying about starting new churches?
One of the first things you notice is how much emphasis there is on church planting as the main way the apostles fulfilled the Great Commission. You know, that whole go and make disciples deal in Matthew 28:19.
Yeah, that one's hard to miss.
Right. And the word there, the Greek mathetusei, it's not a suggestion. It's a command, make disciples, plain and simple. The going, the teaching, the baptizing, those are all how they did it. So the question becomes, how did the apostles actually go about making disciples? What your sources point to is that starting churches was the key.
So it's not just about spreading the message randomly, but building a community, a place for people to belong?
Exactly. And you can almost see the model in how Jesus himself discipled his followers. He taught them, obviously, but he also lived life with them, prayed with them, sent them out together. The apostles took that and scaled it up for the Great Commission. They weren't just dropping knowledge, they were creating spaces for people to grow together.
It's almost like the initial aha moment, the conversion. It's just the start of something bigger.
Exactly. And a great example of this in action is Acts 2.4047, right after Pentecost. What happens there?
Well, you've got Peter preaching, and people are responding. Thousands are getting baptized.
Thousands, yeah. Verse 40 talks about Peter's powerful words calling people to salvation. Then in verse 41, those who believed, they were baptized, and this is important, added to the number, to the church. It wasn't just a bunch of individual conversions happening in a vacuum.
And then verse 42 tells us what they devoted themselves to.
Bingo. The apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking bread, that's communion, and prayer. What you see there, right from the start, is the core of what a church does.
And the passage keeps going. There's all this amazing stuff about miracles, people sharing their possessions, meeting together all the time.
It paints this whole picture. Verse 46 talks about them meeting daily in the temple and in homes, sharing meals with joy. And verse 47 wraps it up. And the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved. It wasn't just a one-time event. It was a thriving, growing community.
So in that short passage, we see it all. Preaching, people becoming part of the community, learning, worship, fellowship, taking care of each other, and then growth. It's all connected.
Exactly. The apostles didn't preach and run. They preached and they gathered. They planted churches. And one of the sources, quoting Lyle Schaller, points out that the Great Commission itself is the strongest reason to plant churches. He sees creating new worshiping communities as the most historically consistent way Christians have obeyed Jesus' command to make disciples.
Okay, so the biblical case seems pretty solid. But what about today? Why, practically speaking, is starting new churches so important?
This is where it gets really interesting. Your sources lay out some really compelling reasons. First off, there's the sheer reality of population growth worldwide. Even places that used to have a good number of churches relative to the population, they're falling behind as the population explodes.
So trying to run up an escalator going down.
Exactly. And the second point is that established churches, they often hit a plateau after about 10 years. They naturally shift towards maintaining what's already there, and sometimes that initial energy for reaching new people fades a bit. They might also struggle to connect with new groups in society.
It makes sense, though, right? Any organization can get comfortable set in its ways. Churches aren't immune to that.
For sure. And that leads to the third point. New churches are often much more flexible, more adaptable to the needs around them. Established churches, sometimes they get stuck in their routines, the music, the programs, the leadership, and they might not change easily to connect with folks who are looking for something different.
So it's not about one way being better, but recognizing that different people connect in different ways.
Exactly, and that's tied to the fourth practical reason. No single church, no matter how big or awesome, can effectively reach everyone in a city or a region. People like different music, different styles of worship, different leadership approaches. The source quotes Scholar again here, saying that no one congregation has the resources or ability to cater to literally every single person.
So it's not a church's fault if they're not reaching every demographic. It's more about recognizing that people have different tastes, different needs.
Right. It's about understanding that people tend to gravitate towards places where they feel comfortable, understood, and that's fine. It's not about rejecting anyone, but about creating more spaces where more people can find their way to faith.
The fifth point seems pretty obvious. It's easier to reach people if you start a church right where they are, in their neighborhood. It's less intimidating, less of a hurdle, especially for folks who aren't already connected to a church.
Makes perfect sense. And lots of places just don't have a church, a visible gospel-preaching presence. Being nearby makes a huge difference in whether people even encounter the message, let alone get involved.
And then, the sixth reason is backed by some interesting research. It says that new churches are actually more effective at reaching and baptizing people who weren't already part of a church. It even quotes Malphurs on this.
That's right. And a lot of these new fast-growing churches, they're really good at connecting with specific groups, like ethnic minorities who maybe don't feel as at home in existing churches.
That's a huge point, that new churches can fill a gap, reach people who are being missed.
Absolutely. And the seventh reason is all about a positive ripple effect. Starting new churches can actually inspire and revitalize older churches. When a church helps birth a new congregation, it can breathe new life into the parent church, a renewed sense of purpose, a fresh vision for mission, even a sense of revival.
Kind of like that saying, it is more blessed to give than to receive.
Exactly. And lastly, the eighth reason focuses on the individual members themselves. It says that people in new churches are often way more engaged, more participatory if the church is close by. Distance makes it hard to be involved beyond just Sunday service, whereas being nearby allows for more involvement in things that help people grow, like small groups, ministries, all that.
So when you put all these practical reasons together with the biblical foundation, it's a pretty strong case for starting new churches. Which leads to the next question. How do we actually do it? What are the principles, the steps involved?
That's the key, right? In the New Testament, especially Acts, it gives us some really valuable insights. Like Acts 11:15 gives us a front row seat to how the church in Antioch was instrumental in starting new churches and the guidance they offered.
So it's not just a matter of putting up a sign and hoping for the best. There are patterns, proven methods.
Absolutely. Understanding those principles and applying them wisely in our own context, that's crucial. And the first principle that your sources emphasize is that existing churches, they need to be part of this. It wasn't a lone wolf thing in the New Testament.
We see that with the church at Antioch, right?
Yeah.
They weren't just focused on their own backyard. Their vision expanded outwards.
Exactly. In Acts 11, it tells us that believers who were scattered because of persecution, they went as far as Antioch and started sharing the gospel with the Greeks, and a whole bunch of them believed and turned to the Lord. And then, like you mentioned earlier, the Holy Spirit guided the Antioch church to commission and send out Barnabas and Saul, who became Paul, for this mission work that involved establishing new churches.
Sending out two of their top guys, that was a big commitment for Antioch.
Huge. And the source points out they were probably also sending financial support and resources. So the core principle here is that existing churches got to be generous, willing to share their resources, people, and money to help new churches get started.
The second principle is about being strategic, choosing your target audience wisely. Paul and Barnabas, they didn't just wander around aimlessly, did they?
Nope, not at all. Roland Allen, one of the sources mentions him, he argued that Paul specifically focused on major cities, places like Ephesus and Corinth, and used those as launch pads for spreading the gospel even further. And in Acts itself, we see that they were really aware of the different groups of people they were trying to reach and how open they were to the message.
Like how they'd go to the Jewish synagogues first and adjust their approach depending on whether they were talking to traditional Jews or God-fearers or Gentile converts.
Precisely. They knew their audience, which helped them make smart decisions about where to invest their time and energy. It was strategic, not random.
The third principle is all about communication. Getting that timeless gospel message across in a way that makes sense, that resonates with your specific audience.
Mhm.
It's not just what you say, it's how you say it.
Exactly. And in Acts, you see all sorts of approaches. One-on-one conversations, preaching to crowds, teaching in different settings, sharing personal stories. Sometimes they'd be really persuasive, other times more reasoned and thoughtful, like when Paul talked to the philosophers in Athens.
And Paul himself says in 1 Corinthians 9 that he became all things to all people so that he might save some. He adapted his approach, but never the core truth of the message.
Exactly. Principle number 4 focuses on gathering those new believers into communities. It wasn't enough to just have individual conversions. The goal was to bring them together, create a space for ongoing discipleship and growth.
Like what we see Paul doing throughout Asia Minor, planting churches in city after city.
Yep. Even when there was pushback, persecution, they made it a priority to gather those believers, whether it was in homes, rented halls, wherever they could. The point is, a new church didn't need a fancy building to get started.
And the fifth principle emphasizes the ongoing development, the nurturing of those new churches. It's not just plant and run. They need support, help to mature.
Absolutely. Paul and his crew, they'd often go back to the churches they'd started. Acts 14 describes how they'd strengthen the believers, encourage them to stand strong in their faith, and they were crucial in developing local leadership, appointing elders in each church to provide ongoing guidance.
So those 5 principles, churches getting involved, strategic targeting, relevant communication, gathering believers, and ongoing development, those are the key takeaways from the New Testament about church planting, right?
Right. Those are the core principles, but the source material rightly points out that while the principles are universal, how you apply them, that's got to be adapted to the specific culture and context. That's where contextualization comes in.
Okay, so how do we take those timeless principles and make them work in our world today? That sounds like a pretty big challenge.
It is, and the sources dive deep into that. Starting with principle #1 involving the church, they talk about 2 main ways new churches get started: pioneering and colonizing. What's the difference?
Well, pioneering is more like starting from scratch. The planter, maybe with a small team, goes into a place where there's not much of a church presence and builds relationships, gathers people from the ground up. Colonizing is more like sending a group, a core group, from an established church to start a new one somewhere else.
And the sources highlight how existing churches can really get on board with this whole church planting thing, like studying the Bible, especially Acts, and really praying about it like the Antioch church did, seeking God's guidance.
They even give this example of a church that did these vision trips during their Sunday school time, that take people into different communities to see the needs firsthand, see where a new church could fit in, like going to underprivileged neighborhoods, apartment complexes, places like that.
That's powerful. It goes beyond just talking about it to actually experiencing it. The source also talks about this idea of prenatal care for new churches, which I think is a great analogy. What's that all about?
Well, it's got 3 parts. Spiritual preparation, which means the sending church really believes in the Great Commission and the role of church planting and fulfilling it. Emotional preparation, meaning they're ready to make sacrifices financially in terms of people, even delaying their own projects or desires to support this. And then sociological preparation, which means taking the time to really understand the community, where the new church is going, the demographics, the culture, the specific needs.
It's about setting the new church up for success right from the start. And that leads to the idea of indigenous church philosophy, which the sources outline with 6 key characteristics.
Right. The first is self-image, meaning the new church understands itself as Christ's church in that particular community.
Yeah.
Then there's self-function, which means they take ownership. They do all the things a church does with local leadership. Self-government means they make their own decisions, biblically sound but culturally relevant. Self-support means they aim to be financially independent. Self-propagation means they have a vision to reach others and maybe even start more churches. And self-giving means they use their resources to serve their community.
It's about empowering these new churches to thrive, to be authentic expressions of the body of Christ in their own contexts. And then the source talks about different models for how these new churches can be established. What are some of those models?
Well, there's the mother church-daughter congregation model, which is pretty common. The sponsoring church kind of takes the lead, provides resources and guidance. It can be good for keeping things doctrinally sound, but there's a risk of the new church not feeling ownership or the mother church being too controlling. Then there's multiple sponsorship, where several churches team up, pool resources. But that can lead to confusion about who's in charge. The multi-congregational church model is where different churches share the same building, which can be good in cities where costs are high. And lastly, the mother church satellite congregation, where the main church staff are involved in the satellite location. That offers support, but the satellite needs to become independent eventually.
So no one-size-fits-all approach, right? The best way depends on the situation, the church is involved. The source also talks about having a missions committee within the sponsoring church to keep things organized, provide support, and be a link between the churches.
Now, for principle #2, choosing the target audience wisely, the sources really emphasize stewardship, making the best use of limited resources. What are some of the practical tools they suggest?
They talk about demographic analysis, looking at population numbers, socioeconomic groups, housing, education, jobs, family structures, different age and cultural groups. Basically understanding the community and who lives there. Then there's religious analysis, figuring out what the church scene is like already. How many churches are they preaching the gospel? Who are they reaching? Who are they not reaching? This could mean actually listing out the churches, talking to their leaders, even visiting some services to see who's there.
And beyond just data, they talk about talking to people, having conversations with community leaders, doing surveys, asking people about their needs, why they're not in church, what kind of activities would appeal to them.
Exactly. It's about really understanding the context, doing your homework before you jump in. And then for principle #3, communicating the message in a relevant way, the source reminds us that the gospel message is timeless, but how we present it that can and should adapt.
They talk about helping people see their own spiritual needs, like Jesus did with the woman at the well in John 4. And they acknowledge that sometimes there's baggage, negative perceptions of Christians. So maybe it's about building friendships first, sharing the gospel naturally within those relationships.
It's about meeting people where they are, relationally and culturally. And then they give a bunch of examples for relevant outreach. Things like vacation Bible school for kids, after-school programs, sports, tutoring, even concerts and arts and crafts, all with a way to connect with the parents too. For adults, maybe film festivals, home Bible studies, support groups, seminars on family stuff, finances, all that, things that address real needs. They even mention phone surveys, inviting people to events, just being friendly and brief, and even direct mail, tying it to the community's needs, sending out a lot, being clear and appealing, and being ready when people respond.
Now, for principle #4, gathering the believers, they describe a process of building that core group.
It often starts with Bible study fellowships, small, informal, focused on fellowship, studying the Bible and praying. The goal is to get people connected, help them grow spiritually. Then that might lead to a more intentional mission fellowship, which becomes the seed for the new church. That's where you might have baptisms, more focused discipleship, build community identity, find potential leaders, and start teaching about financial responsibility.
And then the next step is often a mission chapel, which is like a stepping stone from a small group to a real church, but still maybe under the wing of the sponsoring church. They talk about characteristics of a mission chapel, Sunday school, home groups, regular worship, unity, financial responsibility, and growing in doctrine. And they emphasize clear agreements with the sponsoring church to make that transition smooth.
Exactly. Things like how to accept new members, handle money, communicate, choose a pastor, do communion and baptism, and how the sponsoring church will financially support them as they get going.
Which leads to the last principle, establishing the church as a fully functioning independent entity. The goal is an autonomous New Testament church, but the source points out that doesn't mean it has to be a carbon copy of a big established church right away.
Right. Being autonomous in this context mainly means being able to support themselves financially. Having more resources and paid staff is great, but it's not the defining factor.
They emphasize that the members need to understand what being a church means biblically, like in Acts 2.4047, having a clear mission for that community, having the resources, spiritual gifts, money, people to carry it out, and understanding how they'll make decisions and relate to other churches. And a big part of formalizing that is creating a church constitution.
A constitution provides that framework, that clarity, and they lumped out the typical parts. A preamble stating the purpose, the official name, a statement of faith, a church covenant outlining expected behavior, rules for decision-making, denominational affiliation, if any, and a clear process for making changes to the Constitution down the road.
So wrapping this all up, it's clear from everything you've shared that starting new churches, it's not just a good idea, it's biblical, and it's still crucial today.
And while the principles are timeless, how we apply them, that takes creativity, adaptability, the world's changing, and we got to be willing to try new things while staying true to those core biblical truths about what it means to be the church.
It really makes you think, doesn't it?
Wow.
What's your role in this? Could you be part of starting a new church or supporting one? What stood out to you today? Lots to think about.